Good evening, Kalispera. Welcome to Sparta Live, an online program of lively workshops themed around the history, archaeology, and legacy of Sparta and Laconia, hosted jointly by the Center for Spartan and Peloponnesian Studies of the University of Nottingham and the city of Sparta. This is the site of ancient Sparta in Greece. I'm Chrysanthi Galou, Associate Professor of Archaeology and Director of the Center, and today my co-hosts are Professor Bill Kavanagh, Emeritus Director of the Center, and Dr. Matt Thompson, Teaching Associate in Ancient History and also the Secretary of the Center. But without further ado, I'll pass over to Bill to introduce today's speaker. Bill, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Chrysanthi. It's all, first of all, greetings to all our visitors. It's wonderful to see you joining us this evening. And it's always a very great pleasure for me to introduce young scholars, people who are early in their career, who are introducing all the bright new ideas that we need to make our subject so lively and so exciting. So it's with particularly great pleasure that I welcome Gabriel Bernardo, a PhD candidate at the University of São Paulo in Brazil, and a visiting doctoral researcher who we're so happy to have with us here at Nottingham. Gabriel completed both his BA and MA at the University of São Paulo, the latter under the supervision of Norberto Guarinello. I'm sure I didn't pronounce that quite correctly, and Stephen Hodkinson, our own Stephen Hodkinson, as Commanders and Cowards, Honor and Merit in Sparta. His MA dissertation was awarded the Best Dissertation Prize of the Graduate Programme in Social History of the University of São Paulo in 2019, and was subsequently published in Portuguese as a book in 2020. For his PhD research, Gabriel has moved on to a different topic: how the sea influenced Laconian coastal settlements, relationships both to mainland Laconia and to other sites in the Aegean and the Mediterranean, especially during the period of great Spartan influence. And he has also published on other topics connected to Spartan classical history. It is now focused on the broader approaches to Laconian history. So over to you, Gabriel. We're greatly looking forward to your talk.
Well, thank you very much, Bill. Thank you, and good evening to all who are listening. Kalispera se όλους που μας ακούνε. First, again, thank you, Chrysanthi, Bill, and Matt somewhere, and all the staff of the University of Nottingham for allowing me not only to come to the university twice to make a couple of my researches, and also for allowing me to give this small contribution to the Sparta Live series. Many scholars and colleagues whose work I greatly admire have already made fascinating presentations here, and I promise I'll do my very best to keep up with their level of excellence. So as Bill was saying, I will try to do it this evening by presenting some of the preliminary results of my current PhD research. So it goes without saying that any comment or suggestion will be most welcome. As was just mentioned, this research of mine deals with all the coastal settlements of ancient Laconia during the period of Spartan influence, right? It seeks to understand how the sea shaped the relationship between Laconian coastal settlements and places both inside and outside Laconia. And I'll start sharing my screen right now because I think it'll be easier for what's coming. Just a window. Chrysanthi, could you just tell me if everything is okay?
Yes, everything is fine. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And well, as Matt, right, and as Stavropoulos have done in the last two presentations of the Sparta Live series, my research also tries to include the other Lacedaemonians historical narratives in which they regularly feature only as like appendixes of Sparta. The other Lacedaemonian I refer mostly, but not exclusively, to the periodical, right? The individuals who lived in cities and villages of ancient Laconiki, right? The territory under the direct influence of Sparta, which would correspond roughly to the modern Nomi of Messenia, Laconia, and just to the coast of Arcadia. This attempt of considering the period on their own terms and not appendixes of Sparta is necessary because of some long-lasting images that this approach produced. One might mention, as an example, the idea is still reproduced here and there that the periodical were either facilitators of the contacts between Sparta and the outside world, or even its gatekeepers, like watchmen of everything and everyone that came from the outside into the Spartan zone of influence. Sometimes they even fulfill like both of these functions. In this regard, the study of the coastal regions of Laconiki are especially interesting, given the access the sea allowed both to Laconiki and to other parts of the Aegean, or even to the Mediterranean Sea. And as I said before, my research deals mainly with the Laconian part of Laconiki. And since our time is limited, I will limit my presentation to a specific part of Laconia, one that is frequently on the blind spot of many researchers that deal with ancient Laconia. As you probably have already guessed from the obvious title of this presentation, this part will be the Malea Peninsula. So many scholars, especially archaeologists, have already studied and published about this region, right? So I'm gonna skip some of this. Well, that's okay. Many scholars and specialists have already studied and published about the region, and without works such as those of Giannis Picoulas, Lenis Avu, Maria Tsuli, and many others, I certainly would not be able to be making this presentation this evening. However, I still believe there are more regional approach to data to the Malea Peninsula might give us more insights, not only on its local history, but also on Spartan history and to some level on the Mediterranean history. In this sense, I will argue that at least the Spartan history of the Malea Peninsula could be much more complex than it is usually assumed, regarding both how it became a region under the Spartan influence and how it developed under this influence. In order to do that in a reasonably organized way, this presentation will have two moments. In the first one, and briefer one, I will discuss the spread of the Spartan influence in the region during the Archaic period. The second and longer one will provide some broad strokes on the many activities and settlement patterns reported in the region during the Classical period. So we'll see how Malea's land and maritime geography may help us to understand historical and archaeological issues from a local level to a more regional one, which involves the influences of Spartan and other historical agents. Before we begin, I must clarify that for Malea Peninsula, I mean the entire region south of Mount Curcula and of its valley to the east, which is bounded by the northeast by the Parnon Range that reaches the sea north of Epidaurus Limira. No ancient source tells us the exact limits referred by the ancient toponym Malea, so you could say that this is a purely invented region, one that exists as a region just for the sake of this reason. However, I do believe that physical and human features contained in this region differentiated from neighboring areas, such as the Hellas Plain or even the eastern Parnon foreland. But this is a whole another subject. For now, suffice it to say that, at least in my opinion, this is an invented region, but not a completely arbitrary one. That said, we might proceed to the first part of the presentation finally. Well, the first question to be asked is whether the Malea Peninsula became part of the immediate Spartan zone of influence, right? So when did that came to pass? Many of you are probably thinking about a single passage of Herodotus, which does provide the easiest answer. Before telling the story of how the Spartans defeated the Argives at Piraeus in around 50 BC, securing their control of the region of Piraeus, it also says that before this episode, and I quote, the land west as far as Malea belonged then to the Argives, not only to the mainland, and not only the mainland, but also the island of Kythera and the other islands. So, end of quote. Setting aside Herodotus' cartographical mistakes in locating Malea to the west of Argos, this passage is usually understood as an assertion that the battle of Tyrea not only maintained Spartan control over Tiriatis, but also added the entire southeastern Laconian coast, Kythera, and some minor islands to its control. Herodotus seems to refer to this tradition a second time when he enumerates the 7 ethne that inhabited the Peloponnesus. One of them was of the one of these ethne was that of the Kinurians, Ionians who had been Dorianized by the Argive rule and by time. So Kinuria apparently was in the past the region south of Piraea, but it's not clear where it ended exactly, and therefore we don't know where exactly Malea began, or even if there was another region in between them. Anyway, Herodotus' tradition about the Argive rule of the east coast of the Peloponnesus is frequently taken at its face value, since it provides a very convenient terminus post quem for the establishment of the Spartan influence over a great part of the eastern coast of the Peloponnesus. The internal political reforms at Sparta usually dated to the mid-6th century, and the absence of other information could be some of the reasons why scholars were very prone to accept just this little one more political change after the Battle of Piraea. Besides, the Herodotus narrative does follow a very common historical narrative model, one in which major changes in the political map of extensive regions are credited to a single and significant confrontation between 2 major powers. However, I do believe that a more contextualized reading could help us to identify some implicit agendas in this tradition. Herodotus does not mention his sources, and it was if this was like a local tradition or as a piece of Argive propaganda. We should note that Thucydides, that in 420, the Argives asked for arbitration regarding, and I quote, the issue of the Kinurian land. Firstly, if Thucydides is being accurate, then the Argives themselves recognize that the battle of Piraea narrated all of Kinuria and not of the entire east coast of Laconia. In the sense, Argos' political territory indicates that by the last part of the 5th century, there was in place some kind of Argive policy of pushing a territorial expansion, at least over the northern part of ancient Kinuria. With this territorial claim predates 420, even if by only a decade or so, then it could have informed Herodotus' history about the very controversial topic of the Peloponnesian archaic history. Besides, in my opinion, the claim that only Kinuria from all the claim of Kinuria from all the lost territory would look good for the Argives, at least diplomatically, in the event of the arbitration they were asking for, since they would be asking for way less than was due to them. Some of you might be thinking about the tradition of the century-old enmity between Spartans and Argives, while could be justified by the significant border shared between them if the Argives really controlled the Peloponnesian east coast. Besides, it provides a very convincing background for the Battle at Piraea and for its outcomes. However, apart from a single fragment of details, which you can see in the screen, from the 7th century that mentions a clash between Spartans and Argives and possibly Arcadians, every mention of this enmity between Spartan and Argos are from later periods. Therefore, to my mind, there's no clear indication that the enmity between the two cities already existed in the first half of the 6th century. On these grounds, therefore, I do not think it would be safe to argue in favor of an Argive rule of Malea. One last argument in favor of Herodotus' narrative is based upon 2 geometric vases found at Kythera, an early 8th century local oinoque with some Argive affinities in its decoration, and a fragment of early 7th century Argive crater. The ones that Aris Tsaravopoulos mentioned, or showed us 2 weeks ago, I could not get hold of pictures of them, so excuse me for that. But the important thing here is the idea that these vases could prove an Argive rule in Kythera and consequently in the whole region of the Argolic Gulf north of it, as you can see in the citation. I myself do not feel safe in taking such a significant conclusion from those objects alone. Instead, what they do indicate is that Argive products and possibly Argive people were traveling to the south of the Argolic go. This explains, for instance, why a city called Epidavros Limira, undoubtedly following the Argolic Epidavros, was established at the Malea Peninsula, in a spot with good anchorage and at the last sizable plain before sailors had to sail around the dangerous Cape Malea to the south. But again, there are few indications of the size of Epidavros Limira during their peak period. The only find attributed to the site is that I know about. It's a serpentine seal, possibly of Milos, but surely from the Cyclops. It could have been a stopping point, firstly occupied by Epidaurian and not Argive sailors that saw the advantages of in there and like other people's travels to the south. Still, it does not allow us to project a massive presence of Argives in the whole east coast of Laconia, to the point of it being considered part of an Argive hegemony. On the other hand, I also think it's not possible to pinpoint the exact moment when the Malaeans came under the Spartan zone of influence. We do know, what we do know is that already from the mid or 7th century, the votives at local sanctuaries were following the same trends as the Spartan ones. From the sanctuary of Polyverteleatos, close to Phoeniki, come 3 objects dated to the 7th century. There were also found at the sanctuary of Orthia, not Athens by the time, in Sparta. Of course, just like the vases from Kythia, they do not attest necessarily a Spartan hegemony in the region already by the 7th century. It does show that some tastes and material culture were being shared between those who frequented Orthia and Hyperteleatos. This could be understood perhaps as the beginning of a much longer process of connection and integration, something on the terms described, for instance, by Floridia Fagopoulou in her 2010 PhD thesis, of which I pretty much agree with. Moving on to the 6th century, the Laconian style and taste seem to be already established in devotive practices at both the sanctuary of Apollo Hyperteleatos and at the Heron of Angelona. I'm pronouncing that right. The literature mentions at least, for instance, 12 fragments of 6th century bronze vessels dedicated at Hyperteleatos, and all of them seem to be Laconian. A very characteristic terracotta relief was found at Angelona. Another one was reported from the Apolyvion, the probable site of ancient Boia or Via, of which I unfortunately could not find any further information. So very well be archaic or not. At Castria, another site, Laconian pottery was found from the early 6th century, was found inside a grave. Therefore, if this findings indicate an intensification of the process of approximation between Spartans and Maleans during the 6th century, it could be said that it was the continuation of an ongoing process, not something suddenly triggered by a battle more than 60 kilometers to the north at Tyrea. However, we must keep in mind that Sparta was not the only player on the field during the archaic period. Besides the already mentioned Malian seal from Epidavros Limira, the sanctuary of Apollo Hyperteleatos produced a head of a late archaic statue of Parian marble, and the same grave at Castri produced a Corinthian Rivalus. These objects do not necessarily portray direct or even stable connections with these places, but they highlight the broad range of influences that were active at Malea during the late archaic period. It is equally important to recognize that despite this range, it was Malea's connection to their hand in the next century. Still, for the time being, I do not think we are, or at least I am not, well equipped to say when and how this happened exactly. On the other hand, classical sources do provide us with some important information on the results of this process in later years. So now we may move forward to the second part of this presentation. Well, regarding the literary sources on classical Malea, the settlements at Malea Peninsula appear sporadically the accounts of the Peloponnesian War, mainly because of the Athenian attacks on the coast. Really sorry, I should have pressed that button before. These are the sites of Neapolitan and Castri. This is the slide I really wanted you guys to be seeing right now. So according to Pausanias, Boea was attacked in 456 by Ptolemaides. Thucydides reports the first Athenian attack at Maleia in 424, when the Athenians landed at Epidavros Limera, at the region of Kotirte and Aphrodisia, and at the majority of the villages on the coast. What that means, we can just imagine. Finally, between 414 and 413, multiple Athenian commanders attacked Epidavros Limera 3 times, besides landing at other places. Again, we cannot be sure what that means. The last of these campaigns, Demosthenes, the same guy who fortified Pylos and Charicles, not only plundered part of the territory of Epidavros Limera, but also pulled the trick already used at Pylos some years before. They landed on the coast of Laconia, opposite to Kythera, where the temple of Apollo stands. We are not sure where this was exactly. And laying waste part of the country, fortified a sort of isthmus, to which the Helots, the Lacedaemonians, might desert, and from hence plundering incursions might be made. These attacks seem to have been aimed at stirring discontent among the Perioikoi. Enough attacks on their land might make them less prone to start in Spartan campaigns outside Laconia, or even more prone to begin local stasis. Thucydides actually says that this was a preoccupation in 424, when Spartans organized local garrisons to provide some safety for the Perioikoi. Otherwise, if the Athenians were successful, they would seriously impair the Spartan ability to conduct any campaign outside Laconiki. The Spartans would no longer be able to rely on the increasingly important number of Perioikoi for their armies, and in the scenario, they would have to quell local pockets of resistance to Spartan authority. However, this might not be the only reason why Maleia was constantly targeted by the Athenian commanders. As Thucydides' Archidemos reminds us in the preambles of the Peloponnesian War, war is mainly a matter of resources, and there is plenty of evidence that Maleia had lots of it. To begin with, the Malea Peninsula has on its west coast 2 of the largest plains in Laconia, the Molai and Vatica plains. Combined, they have almost 90 square kilometers of well-watered soil that even to this day is an important source of agricultural products. Best oranges I've ever had. On its east coast, Epidavros Limera, the most targeted city by the Athenians in all Laconiki, was a privileged position. It bordered an alluvial coastal plain and close to the upper plains and streams around modern Agios Ioannis, which is the biggest city in the region after Monemvasia, I think. Therefore, the ancient Maleia could provide a sustenance for a significant population, what may explain some features of its history under the Spartan leadership. Firstly, it would be important for the Spartans to keep the locals loyal to their authority, since the Maleans could provide significant contingent for the Lacedaemonian army, as we have already seen. This could at least partially explain the presence in 424 of a garrison on the land opposite to Kythera, after the Athenians had already taken the island, occupied the island. We're not sure where exactly was either Kotirte or Aphrodisia, the best guess being on the northwestern corner of Vatica. Even so, Thucydides also mentions 2 other garrisons, one at Tyrea and another at Methone, this one in Messenia. Tyrea more to the north, close to Argos well, we have seen it already. Spartans commanded both. The one at Tyrea was led by a Lacedaemonian called Tantalus, son of Patroclus, who got injured and captured while trying to resist an Athenian attack in 424. Brasidas, son of Thales, the famous Brasidas, led the one at Methone, which according to Thucydides did manage to fight off an Athenian attack in 431. What indicates that this garrison strategy was not completely an innovation in 424. Kythera, another hot target for the Athenians, also had a Spartan-led garrison, but apparently for broader purposes and not because of the ad hoc Peloponnesian War efforts. Either way, if the Malean garrisons followed this pattern of local forces led by a Spartan commander, it might hint at Spartan active preoccupation in maintaining Maleia under its influence in a very turbulent context. It's impressive that no garrison is mentioned at Epidavros Limera, but that might be due to the possibility that its Acropolis was somehow fortified. The most recent evaluation of the retaining walls at Epidavros Limira, that of Mathieu Guintrand, his PhD thesis finished in 2017, dates the construction of the walls at Epidavros Limira to the 4th or to the 3rd century BC, on account of its similarity to other late classical fortifications to the north of Epidavros Limira. Some argue that the wall could have had, or it still has, classical or even archaic foundations, but only systematic excavations could answer that. Either way, Epidavros Limira's Acropolis is on top of some steep and rocky slopes, which would naturally protect it to some level. And it is possible that some kind of fortification was already in place during the Peloponnesian War, perhaps one less identifiable in its visible remains today, but strong enough to resist at least 4 Athenian raids. Other than manpower, the Spartans probably also had other reasons to worry about Mαλέα. One of them was the possibility that at least some of them had land properties at the peninsula. Xenophon tells us that the kings had choice land in many of the cities of the Perioikoi. And, as I have already mentioned, Thucydides says that one of the Demosthenes and Charicles' goals in fortifying an isthmus at Mαλέα in 413 was to provide a refuge to which the helots of the Lacedaemonians might desert. Firstly, if there were royal states in the plains of Molawe, Vatica, or even Epidavros Limira, which are the best candidates for choice land at the Malea Peninsula, then their preservation will be in the agenda of the two of the most important political actors in Sparta. Secondly, it is still debatable if helots could have been owned by Perioikoi, or even if the Athenians mistook regular slaves of the Perioikoi for helots. But the fact that at least some helots could have defected to this fortified Malean isthmus or peninsula may indicate that other Spartans had properties in the region, as Stephen Hodgkinson has already suggested about this passage of Thucydides in his fifth book. In this case, then other Spartans besides the kings would be very interested in securing Malean obedience to Spartan leadership. Other land-based resources were also exploited at Mαλέα. The most significant of them, or at least the most archaeologically noticeable, was iron, smelted at least 4 different sites. The ores were apparently mined at Agios Eliseos and brought down to the Vatica plain to be smelted. Piles and piles of slags produced by the smelting process were found at Agios Iorios, Psafaki, Neapolivion, and Paleocastor. And the chemical analysis conducted by Yannis Vasiakos and Adonia Maria Ziani, among others, produced very interesting data. Firstly, Vasiakos believes that not only that the strata where the slags were found may be securely dated to the classical period, but also that they belong to a same period, given the chemical similarity of the samples collected from different sites. These slags show that the ancient metallurgists managed to recover from 37% to 50% of the iron contained in the ores, a relatively high rate for the classical period. He estimates that the workshops at Neapolivion and Psafaki alone processed around 2,400 tons of ores. And it is a low estimate, since a huge amount of slags were removed from Neapolivion before the 1980s for building roads and other stuff. At a 50% rate of recovery, we're looking at a production of at least 700 tons of iron, and at Neapoli and Psafaki alone. So Ziani helps to explain this quality rate. According to her, the sites where these ores were smelted were specifically selected because of their geographical characteristics. Not only were they on hills exposed to the drier northern winds, something essential for iron smelting, but also strategically close to the sea. This last point is relevant because such an amount of iron was not intended to supply just a local market. It was probably commercialized to the sea, where heavy freights could be more easily handled. Some of you might be thinking, as many already have, that this is the obvious place for us to look for the iron supply of the Lacedaemonian army. This will make a place of crucial importance, and its military to Sparta, and for its for the sustenance of its militaristic ethos, and will perfectly explain, for instance, why Xenophon, during his narrative of the conspiracy kingdom, mentions an iron market at Sparta. I do not disagree with this interpretation entirely, but some caution is needed. First, because Vatican workshops are an obvious source of iron for Sparta, but not only for Sparta. Mirto Georgakopoulou, for instance, makes a good point that the mines at Vatican are the most probable sources of iron ores smelted locally at Kythera, mainly during the classical period. Secondly, because I do believe we should get past the idea of a typically militaristic Sparta, one whose army would require like a typically huge amount of iron. This does not mean that the iron that possibly arrived at Sparta from Vatican was not forged into weapons, but that it was not exclusively exploited to produce weapons for the Lacedaemonian army. In the very description that Xenophon makes Spartan iron market, he does mention swords, but also knives, spits, axes, hatchets, sickles, objects that he could characterize as primarily as tools, not as well. Secondary systems also, but primarily as tools. In addition to that, the 3rd century author Dimachus of Platea, he seems to have said that Laconian iron, possibly the one produced at Vatican, was especially good for stone working tools. Again, tools, not necessarily on weapons. In this sense, we must again be careful not to automatically connect the periodically and their activities to Spartan demands alone. Malean miners and ironsmiths were probably dealing with the Spartan demands. It would be impressive if they were not. But they were also very well positioned to trade with other centers, enough for Dimachus to list the Laconian iron among the best irons he knew by the time. And here we find ourselves looking at another reason why Malean settlements probably had a broader relevance, one that supersedes the role as just as suppliers of Sparta. I refer more specifically to the position of the Malea Peninsula on crossroads of the Mediterranean and Aegean sailing routes. So any undertaking between the eastern and western Mediterranean, or between the Aegean and the western Mediterranean, at least those that could not be conducted through the ports of Corinth, would have to pass through the sea around the Malea Peninsula, Kythera, and Crete. However, to sail around Cape Malea was, and still is, a very dangerous enterprise. Sea and breezes, which at times blow in opposite directions, generate sudden swallows, and the sea currents from the northern Aegean and from the western Mediterranean meet at some point south of Malea. However, even this could have worked in favor of the Malean settlements. This is the Malean settlements. Okay. Epidavros Limera, for instance, is the closest part to Cape Malea on its eastern coast. So it was almost the last chance sailors had to wait for the winds to calm before sailing around the Cape. Or the first place to which they would go if something went wrong in their way into the Aegean. This probably valid for Via or for Boyae, one of the last two ports before the Cape on its western coast, and the first for those sailing west. It's interesting that even a modern, like 2022 sailing guide reports that yachts have already stood for a whole week moored at Elefonisos or Neapoli, waiting for the northeastern wind to die out and allow passage into the Aegean. The knowledge about this strategical position might even be hinted at the sanctuaries connected to Boyae and Epidavros Limera. Pausanias in the 2nd century AD says that there was a temple dedicated to Zeus Soter, or savior, at the harbor of Epidavros Limera, and a statue of Poseidon at the place called Niphaeon on the coast between Boyae and Cape Malea. There is no solid evidence that a temple of Zeus, that the temple that Pausanias mentions, was already in place during the classical period at Epidavros, the port of Epidavros Limera, But Eusebius does mention a sanctuary of Poseidon at the recesses of Cape Malea, which could correspond to the later Nymphaeon. Safety against the sea unpredictability was and still is one of the main worries of either of local or foreign sailors. Something very well exemplified by Ares in the collection of coins from the sanctuary of Poseidon at Dragonera, one of the coasts, an island off the coast of nearby island of Kythera. And in this sense, it does make sense to honor ports Zeus, the god that controlled the very winds that made Cape Malea a dangerous obstacle, and Poseidon, the god in charge of the sea itself. Malea, therefore, seemed to have been an interesting region both for land dwellers and for maritime travelers, and I believe this is also shown on how the peninsula was occupied during the classical period. To this moment, the already published archaeological literature on the Malea Peninsula describes at least 31 archaeological sites with indications of activity during the classical period. I must highlight the at least, because there are, again, at least 20 non-dated archaeological sites distributed throughout the peninsula, with many finds yet to be published and many sites dated to later or early periods that are waiting to be properly excavated. Therefore, this picture is incomplete and might hopefully change a lot in the following years. Still, I believe that it can provide us with some broad strokes on how Malea was occupied during the classical period. Firstly, it's necessary to know that until now, only one significant sanctuary was found, that of Apollo Hyperteleatus. The Heron of Angelona produced many findings, but by far not as many as those found at Hyperteleatus. The site at Vardia on the southeastern corner of the cape is thought to be some sort of sanctuary because of the miniature vessels observed there, as well as because of its quite inhospitable position on the very top of Mount Vardia, whose slopes practically, this is hard adverb, define Cape Malea. Both Angelona and Vardia were not systematically excavated, so it's impossible to say if they were more important than they seem to be. Anyway, it is plausible that Hyperteleatus satisfied Malea's religious demands on at least a level. The sanctuary was at the margins of one of the Great Plains of Malea, and perhaps not coincidentally on a land route that connected it to Epidavos Mira. Further on, my research will try to calculate a rough estimate of how much time was required for someone to travel from Vatica Plain to the sanctuary. But for now, I limit myself to suggest that this effort was not that great, given that a probable route crossed the hills to the northwest of the plain. And it's interesting because it begins next to Castri and arrives at the Molai Plain next to Catafi, both fortified sites, which adds to the probable importance of the route. That seems to hold at least of the importance of the regional importance of the sanctuary at Hyperteleatus seems to hold truth at least for the Hellenistic and Roman periods, when decrees established at the temple mentioned people from Epidavos Mira, Cotirta, Via, and mainly from Sopos, which is at the Molai Plain. But even so, people from all over the peninsula. Now, regarding where the Malaeans actually lived, this is a more difficult issue. Few of the archaeological sites labeled by the scholarship as probable settlements were excavated. So, and if they really were settlements, it's really hard to guess their size. If there were simple, or even if there were simple, like rural seasonal dwellings and groupings of more permanent dwellings. Besides, no extensive survey of the plains had its results published yet, so it is hard to know how complete or incomplete the picture I'm going to show you guys is. As far as I know, an extensive surface survey covering the southern part of Vatica Plain was conducted between 2008 and 2010 by Eleni Manzurani and Aphrodite Maltezou. To my knowledge, I could just get hold of a short preliminary result, which is very promising, by the way. But for now, what we might say about the occupation of Mαλέα is that the coast and the foothills that surrounds the plain seem to be the preferred place for habitation. No classical settlements seem to have been identified in that, and this could mean many things. One of them reflects the archaeological work of the past decades, which consists mostly on surface surveys and rescue excavations, works that are usually conducted in areas of civil construction, and that because of that is generally situated outside the plains, where most of the modern agricultural land is. Otherwise, if this picture does reflect a sample of the possible classical settlements, then the classical strategy of living outside their agricultural land, more close to the hills or even to the sea. The hills offered an escape from summer floods and marshy lands, and we do know that at least the Molae plain was prone to flooding, is prone to flooding. And they all living in these places, they could also live close to rocky soils that, as Jan Spekulis has demonstrated very well, were the best places to carve those parallel growths of ancient carved roads. On the other hand, the sea offered an easier access to maritime resources and trading routes, as those probably needed by the ironsmiths of Vatica. At places like Boyae or at modern Neapolivion, one could even have the best of these both worlds. Moreover, it was not by chance that later on the inhabitants of 3 other villages from the surroundings of Vatica plain, Side, Aphrodite, and Netis, moved to Boyae, and not the other way around. However, the sea does bring only opportunities. It also brings opportunists. So, as I have commented before, the Athenians were very keen, right, to raid the Laconian coast during the Peloponnesian War. The sea and Laconian sandy beaches provided Athenian fleets with many suitable places to visit, as well as with safe emergency exit, at least while the Lacedaemonians did not command their own fleets. Besides, any coastal town had to be aware of pirates and their southern raids, which probably shared many similarities with what the Athenians were doing. That said, it's impressive the almost absence of coastal fortifications at Mαλέα. Starting from the north at the Mount Kukula, Waterhouse and Hope Simpson observed a single wall, possibly ancient, that was interpreted by Epicurus as the remains of a Spartan Hellenistic fortification. The black glaze pottery observed at the site might date it to the classical period, but it's impossible to be sure of its date or even of the function of the wall without excavations. The place does provide a great watch post for the Laconian Gulf and to the coastal road from the Hellas plain to the Molae plain, but its characterization as a fortification, to my mind, owes much the influence of the medieval fort that was also set up in the vicinities. Also, the same is for Zas, where parts of 1 meter large walls were found at the summit of a coastal hill. Since the majority of the published findings of the site were dated to the Bronze Age, it is at least unsafe to date to the historical periods without to date the walls to the historical periods without a further archaeological research, even if the place looks ideal for a fortified acropolis. Catafigi is certainly a fortification, and it is a very conspicuous spot. Like it is right beside the road from Molae to Vatica, and it is also datable only by the observed in its surroundings. Its masonry, as the black glaze pottery that was observed around it, could be either from the classical or from the Hellenistic period. It's impossible to say for sure, as Gintan has recently rightfully argued. Still, it still is an easily defensible position that could have served its immediate inhabitants if they required some kind of refuge or a fee in the occasion of a coastal raid. Castile is by far the most curious case. There is like a 200 peribolos of 200 meters that surrounds part of a hilltop, being interpreted as a fortification for multiple reasons. Either it was set up to protect the iron workshops against sea raids, or as a response to the Athenian fortification of an isthmus at Mαλέα in 424. Other finds at the region indicate an occupation from the Archaic to the Hellenistic period, so it's very hard to propose a date without recurring to other known historical events or archaeological data. I myself think it would not work as a protection for the iron workshops, perhaps to its workers, but not to the workshops themselves. As I said before, the most productive workshops apparently was the one at Psafaki, close to Neapolivion. In that sense, the protection of the iron production would most logically be closer to Psafaki and not 7 kilometers away from it, or even more, like 12 kilometers away from that Paleocastro, which is to the southeast of Neapoli. Guintrand's suggestion that the fort was a response to the Athenian fortification of the isthmus at Mαλέα during the Peloponnesian War is, to me, a preferable one, but only if the Athenian fortified peninsula was in fact Elefonisos, which is just an assumption, a plausible one, but an assumption. In this case, since Castries was on the mainland route to the Molai Plain, it will be very well situated to limit to Vatica Plain one of the intended effects of this Athenian fortification, which is the defection of Helots. However, if this is correct, then Castries is the response to a specific event, not a long-term strategy against sea raids. Lastly, the less ambiguous case is the fortification of Epidavros Lindra, a complex of fortified acropolis inside external walls that only reinforced an already naturally strong position. As I have already said, it is debatable if these walls were already in place during the classical period. Still, I believe that the conditions I mentioned before, of Epidavros Lindra being one of the last ports before Cape Mαλέα, its good anchorage, and the availability of extensive land, made it a very attractive target, something made very clearly by the Athenians during the Peloponnesian War. Therefore, perhaps some kind of defensive device might have been in place during the classical period, even if one not so elaborated and more based on the natural defenses of the Acropolis. In summary, only 2 of the possible 5 fortifications mentioned here seem to have been guarded the Malean periodically from seaborne raids, 1 in each coast and none in the Vatica Plain. This could mean that most of the population was scattered more to the countryside, just a couple of fortified refuges would be enough. We should have in mind that the range of seaborne attacks were not great, since they were meant to be sudden descents to sack, capture locals to be sold as slaves or ransom, and then depart, preferably before an organized resistance could fire back and cut the invading army's escape route through the sea. So, to spread the force in huge plains like those of Mαλέα Peninsula until it reached its margins could be very dangerous. So those who inhabited far from the coast would be kind of safer, perhaps. Not only an assault would be less probable at these places, more distant from the sea, but they would also have a greater response time, which they could use to run to the hills or to other surroundings less easily navigable by outsiders. Another thing might have also helped the Maleans, one more connected to its membership of the Lacedaemonian community. Let us remind now that the Athenian strategy of επιτυχισμός, of using a big attack Laconian coast, for this to work, the Athenians had firstly to occupy places close to their targets. This was why Kythera was taken by them in 424, and why the isthmus at Mαλέα was fortified in 413. These were bases to launch attacks at coastal villages. Ancient ships could not stay long periods at sea, so the wooden structure required some drying periods. The crew needed time at land to eat, to rest, to refill their stock of provisions, and perhaps to unload any plunder. So to do that in an enemy's territory would be very dangerous. So a nearby base was paramount. The Lacedaemonian strategy seemed to have been to deal with that by occupying, both culturally and politically, the most obvious place for this kind of operation, Kythera, right? And as Thucydides tells us, the initial reason for an interest in Kythera seems to have been to hinder pirates to attack their lands at the most vulnerable points of the Laconian coast. A quick look at the map that it's on your screen shows that the Malean plains could have been some of these very vulnerable points where the coast did not rise abruptly towards the surrounding seas. In this case, pirates would not be able to use Kythera as a base and a refuge, providing more safety to the Malean coastal settlements. Of course, we should think that this was enough. Epidavros Limira apparently was not as favored by this strategy as the settlements at the western coast of Malea. So it is understandable that its acropolis was on a natural defended spot. The same goes for Bozas, situated on a high spot that, even if not fortified, could provide a privileged point of view of the surroundings and of any impossible incoming threat. So, going now for a conclusion, finally. From the sea, then, we got back to the land. I began this last part of the presentation commenting on the land resources available for the inhabitants of Malea. We then moved on to the perks and perils that the sea added to this picture. And finally, we reached Kythera before coming back again to Malea's sandy and apparently vulnerable beaches. I hope to have convinced at least some of you that Malea's history, from archaic to classical period, can be far more complicated than it is usually assumed. The integration of the peninsula into the Spartan zone and influence, rather than a prize of a single battle, seems to have been the product of a much longer process of approximation and perhaps of negotiation. By the end of this process, the Lacedaemonians of Malea developed a complex relationship with forces both from inside and outside Laconiki. Sparta made its presence felt locally through its kings and possibly through other Spartan landowners, but maybe not to the point of determining every aspect of the periodic life. Iron was smelted locally and commercialized through the sea. Villages on the margins of the plains possibly assured their cultivation, and coastal towns took advantage of their positioning on important and perilous maritime routes. Local sanctuaries, such as those at Angeloni Vardia, existed in parallel to the regional cult center at Hyperteleatus, and the wheel routes that Piculas have identified indicate routes that connected the main points of the peninsula, even to inner Laconia. The benefits of Lacedaemonian Kythera was probably felt at the western coast of Malea, but less probably at Epidavros Limira. The same being valid for the Spartan efforts of avoiding stasis during the Athenian raids of the 5th century. This picture shows that Malea and its inhabitants, as probably those from other parts of the periodic keys, were more just appendixes to Spartan history. They were, in many levels, agents on their own, in both local and regional levels. They followed the designs of the Lacedaemonian community led by Sparta, and at the same time took advantages of its benefits while pursuing on agendas, which cannot be summarized in serving as suppliers and guards for the ghost of a huge Spartan state. There still is a long way to go before we manage to almost literally uncover the details of this picture. Even so, I believe that we already have enough to at least propose a truly Lacedaemonian history, one that includes Spartans, Perioikoi, Helots, and multiple other groups that sometimes are overshadowed by some of the preoccupations of our ancient sources. And that was it. Thank you very much, and I'll start my presentation somehow. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Gabriel, for this very fascinating presentation of the history and archaeology of the Malea Peninsula and the Spartan presence. I'm sure people will have a lot of questions about the material that you have presented. Matt Thompson will be leading the Q&A, but can I ask the first question?
Of course.
Do you think it is possible to study Epidavros Limira without taking into account Zarax, which is so close? Because I have kind of like a slight objection on the definition of Cape Malea and the boundaries that you presented.
Yeah, I totally understand and as you suggested for me to add even the Kiparisi to the presentation, I guess. But yeah, I think it's just a matter of what the questions are you making to the sources, right? The questions I am asking to the data available have more to do with the landscape in which some sites are inserted into, like the sit upon what place, which places they are. And Zarax is a very, to my mind, is more close to the landscape to the north of Epidavros Limira, which is like a plain that is easily accessible, but in front of like huge Parnon mountains that makes it this accessibility a bit difficult. But if you, depending on the question, like if I myself was studying like the connection between the Argolic Gulf with other places, then yes, totally. You cannot study Epidavros Limina without considering Zarax or even Kiparisi and perhaps even Prasia, which like they have a very troubled history even to the 3rd century BC. So the problem is that literary sources, they say few things about Zarax. We know it was depopulated eventually, and for some reason get like this amazing wall that we cannot like specifically date yet. But yes, depending on the question you're answering, you will have to add Zarax to your thinking. You know, it's just like for now, I think it does make more sense to group it with the Eastern Parnon Foreland settlements. But yes, it is a nice thing to do if you're planning to study like the whole coast of the east coast of Male of Laconia.
I think, well, that's my personal view, both like as someone who has looked at the Epidavros Limiras for the last 20 years, plus as a local now. People very often, when we study a specific area, we forget that landscape doesn't really play, like the terrestrial landscape doesn't really play a huge importance when people are traveling. So I'll give you an example. Till the 1980s, people from Vies, from Napoli, Vion, were not taking the bus to Athens. They were taking the boat. And it was easy for them to go around Cape Malea and up to Piraeus. Until much later, until the Kiparisi road was constructed, people were only having the sea route to follow. So I think these may be things that we need to consider when we're looking at a maritime kind of like a landscape and at a peninsula of this type, because my impression is, and this impression I have by walking around this area, is that Epidavros Limira already from the prehistoric period, plus the entire Malea Peninsula, acts more like an island, mainly because you have Parnon and it's kind of like isolated. So maybe we should consider that peninsula as such. But I really enjoyed your talk. And also I would like to add that one site that we need to desperately look at is the Monia, the ancient Kotirta. Because it has like a lot of phases from possibly from the Stone Age up to the Roman period. But great job. Well done. Bill, do you have a question?
Well, first of all, I want to say congratulations for a fantastic piece of work. I really was very impressed at the way you've dealt with all the different sources, reflecting particularly on the classical period, but much more broadly than that. There are so many questions one might turn to at random almost. You talked about the iron resources. There have been some suggestions, though perhaps less well supported, that copper was also exploited in this area. Have you thoughts about that?
So yeah, I was talking to Chrysanthi a couple of weeks ago on that, and I really struggled I reflected if I should add that to the presentation today, but the reports that I had access to, and one of them is Chrysanthi, they don't give us quite like a good view of this place, of these mines, if they were ancient or not, if there was any, how to date them. And if there is a way to date them, this reports, I think they were not published yet, but I know that one specific thing that is very interesting is that in Molae Plain, there's like this big copper mines, which would make a huge difference in our historic knowledge about the region, because the sanctuary of Apollo Epiteliatus, which is on the fringes of the Molae Plain, is the place with the greater number of bronzes registered in any Laconian sanctuary. So if bronze is made of copper and no, I can't remember the name in English now, but if this was one of the stuff used to make the bronzes that were dedicated to Apollo Epiteliatus, it would change a lot. Like it makes sense, right? You have an easy source of one of the things you use to build bronze vessels, and you can dedicate it close by. So I really do think that when all these stuff are duly published, we'll have like a very different image of what we know now. And yes, the copper thing is something to look at for sure. Yeah.
You're muted, Bill.
Oh, sorry. Thank you very much. And I think really we need to open the discussion to other members who are attending, because I'm sure there'll be many other questions.
Matt?
Oh, well, we have some things coming into the chat now, so and I think I see Adrienne's hand up. So let me ask Luke's question from the chat first, and then we can see if we can unmute Adrienne.
Yes, I will do that. Yeah.
But yeah, so a question from Luke. Have you considered any modern comparative work in your comparison between Mαλέα and Kenuria? And he is particularly curious if Saconian-speaking communities could be evidence for historical community networks between Parnon and Mαλέα.
Yeah, Kenuria was the last region I was studying, and thank you very much for the question, by the way. And comparatively, what we can say about the Kenuria is that they seem to have a very similar process of approximation of the Spartan influence. So we do have some sites in Kenuria, mainly close to modern Leonidio and more to the region of the port. Some very nice excavations were conducted there in the last decade. So it is impressive that the region seemed to have like a more northeastern, that it's turned to more to the northeast of the Peloponnese during the Archaic period, and then suddenly it changes to the Laconian, which is very interesting. But again, I don't know if this represents like a pure Spartan invasion, like of the place, or just like the results of an ongoing process. And the most interesting point is that to the north of Epidavros Mirais, where we can actually see the historical change more easily, because that is the area that the Argives were disputing for during the late 5th and early 4th centuries, and until perhaps the 3rd century. So it changes very significantly, including by like building gigantic walls, and even in the small sites such as Kiparisi, like it has like this huge wall for like the small, what was probably a small settlement close to the bigger settlement of Asia. So, and this like this huge historical change is not seen in the Malaya Peninsula, perhaps because it is too for longer under the Spartan influence. So if it worked, why change it, right? So I think these are the two most contrary. We have like a more eventful history in the northeastern part of Lakoniki, and perhaps a more calm one on the Malaya Peninsula. But again, people from could say against that, like they were less protected by Spartan measures during the Peloponnesian War. They probably didn't have much access to the Kythera occupation security. So yeah, these are very different regions, but at the same time, they answer to very similar historical events.
Can I say something about the Chaconian speaking communities?
Oh, yes.
Because it's something
Please.
like people may be interested, because I was talking with some locals last week about that, so I could share the knowledge they shared with me. So it seems that the Chaconian dialect is still spoken in parts of Cape Malea, in particular the Vatica region, and also we have few survivals at Elafonisos. And I can actually say that we are planning next year, if everything goes okay, to have a symposium on the Chaconian dialect through the center in collaboration with local associations and philologists. And also people, if they are interested, there is a group in Leonidion that teach the Chaconian dialect. And I know that they teach Chaconian in the local school as well. So if people are interested, I can provide some more information via email.
Yeah, brilliant. Okay. So we have a really good comment here from Eleni. I'm not sure if there's a question in there specifically, but I think there's some good information that it would be worth taking a look at in the interest of pronunciation, if nothing else. I won't read it all out to you, but I'll skip ahead to Adrian's question, where he says, how do you characterize and identify the metallurgic workshops? So do we have any structural remains or any slags or other metalworking debris?
Oh, okay. Well, what survived most is the piles of slag that came from the furnaces that were used like to take out to smelt the ore into iron. So these are mainly the main things, and the datation I believe, because of the reports, I've never been to the place, are from pottery. So you might think about like a huge workshop, not a huge, but at least a significant workshop there. Is not like a seasonal thing. And the very interesting thing is that close to Punta, where you go to Elafonisos, right on the southern foothills of Valles Eliseos, you do have like these roads going down to the sea. Like you have some roads right there. So it could be where they actually shipped the ores, either for Kithira or just to get a spin around Elafonisos and deliver them to the south of the Vatica Plain, southeast of Vatica Plain. So short, in a nutshell, it's because there's like a huge amount of slags that people could not just like brought there from somewhere else. It probably is a local thing, like is the whatever you have left from the production of iron from ores. Yeah, so that's it. And it really is required to say that apparently none of these sites have been like excavated. So if there is like any structure there, we still have to uncover them. Please do, whoever is responsible for that.
Oh, brilliant. Thanks. So we have another question in now. Do you think there is anything unusual or characteristic about the Malayan sanctuaries or votive assemblages which distinguish them from other Spartan ones?
Well, I do think, well, the most distinguishable thing actually begins in the late Hellenistic period, probably. There is some indication that it goes back to at least to the classical period, but most of the stuff was found in late Hellenistic period, which is like bronze ribbons with the names of the priests. They apparently were dedicated by priests of the sanctuary to the sanctuary when they, I don't know, assumed post or left the post. And these things have never been found anywhere else that I know about in Greece, at least in mainland Greece. So it could be a possibility that when the Koinea of the Lacedaemonians, right, the League of the Lacedaemonians, like breaks from Sparta, new traditions were invented, and new shared practices were begin to be differentiated from those at Sparta. And this is, I think, this is a possibility, even because as Adrien Delahaye has already published a paper recently about that. The material culture during the classical period is amazingly homogeneous with the Spartans. Like, you cannot differentiate a period from Maleia from a Spartan, like, or from any other period keys, any other place in the period keys. So yes, I do think that when you separate them politically, there's not like a complete separation. Obviously, Spartans still have influence in the Iperterato sanctuary and on other places in Vatica and Molai plain, but you do have like innovations when this happens. So I think this is really important in that sense. But yeah.
Matt, I think it's definitely worth reading Eleni Kolaitis' comment, because she is the scholar whose research has revolutionized our knowledge of the region, because she has done intensive work on the sea level changes, and I think it's definitely worth discussing it further. And if Eleni would like to comment, I will unmute her, because she is kind of like a treasure of knowledge for the region.
No, absolutely, yeah, absolutely. So I'm happy to read through it, unless we can unmute Eleni and she can contribute the knowledge directly. So what we have here is so we have regarding the coastal landscape from the classical period to Roman times, we estimate a mean sea level at least 3.6 meters lower than at present. So except for Vatica Bay and Limen Naraka, which is Zarax, where both sites provide a natural harbour morphology. It is worth mentioning the absence of harbour works on Mirtu's side, only submerged buildings and quarries, despite the existence of the Eastern Coastal Road, which Pikulas would described, and the extensive metallurgical activity that necessitated harbour works for iron loading and trading. And he strongly believes that we have to make new readings of the coastal landscape of the Malleus Peninsula and the eastern coast of Laconia.
Eleni's PhD thesis is available online. It was submitted in 2019. And the good thing is that in addition to her expertise, like doctoral expertise, she's also a brilliant geologist. So look out for the PhD thesis. It's really important for the region.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I think I see no more questions in the chat. If anyone is, I'll give people a few more moments in case they're typing. But if not, I can hand back over to Chrysanthi, unless we have time for more questions.
I think we can let people go and have their dinner. But let me thank Gabriel again for a very fascinating paper. I'm pretty sure everybody enjoyed it. I really enjoy discussing with Gabriel his thesis while he's here. And I'm pretty sure the further research into the topic will bring a lot of important evidence and a lot of important conclusions about the region. So I would also like to thank Mayor Doukas and the City Council of Sparti, the University of Nottingham and the marketing team of the School of Humanities for the continued support. Also, Mr. Petros Kapernarakos, owner of Money Space and Vachos Radio News for media sponsorship, and of course, Bill and Matt for co-hosting the webinar today with me. Of course, and above all, I would like to thank all of you who have attended today's talk, and we very much hope that you'll be joining us again next Thursday, that is the 2nd of March, again 5 p.m., for the final webinar of the series for this academic year. We're not going away, we'll come back in autumn. So our guest speaker next week will be Sarah Norvell, who will talk to us about Dorian civic dining, rethinking the Syssition on Crete and at Sparta. Until then, have a very nice evening and καληνύχτα και να περνάτε καλά. Thank you very much.